is a stretch of land in the high desert where the wind moves like a living thing, and sound does not behave in the way you expect. People who live near those salt-bright ridges say the night there sits on the earth rather than above it, and that if you listen long enough, you can hear your name spoken by something that has never met you. Daniel did not believe any of that. He believed in checklists, in weather reports, in dry boots and a full radio battery. And yet, in late autumn, with the grass turned colorless and brittle and the starlight cold as old glass, he took the night shift at the ranger station that overlooks Coyote Canyon, and those neat beliefs began to loosen. The station was a rectangle of timber and tin perched above miles of broken stone. The radio sat on a metal desk by the window. The chair had a dent that fit him, and a white enameled mug with a chipped rim waited by the coffee tin. The first hours of the shift were always orderly. He checked the register for late hikers, confirmed weather with the distant township, listened to the hiss of the radio and the small domestic noises a building makes after dark. The wood flexing, the wind tone in the eaves, the soft pop of cooling nails. He liked this part. It made him feel useful in a quiet way. By 9, the land had emptied itself of color. The ridgeline was a black thread. Far below, the dry riverbed shone faintly, a pale scar that twisted out of sight. Daniel stood with his mug at the window and watched a single moth tap the glass. It moved without hurry, a small pale thing in an unending dark. He drank and listened. Somewhere out on the flats, something shifted, just a scrape, stone on stone. The noise had no direction. The canyon took every sound in and returned it changed. He didn't look away from the glass at first. He didn't want to give the land that courtesy. He had promised himself he would be different from the men in town who fed the station's reputation with stories like live bait. He would not jump at sounds. He would not let shadows undress themselves into creatures. Still, he took the flashlight and stepped outside. The cold bit into his cheeks, and the smell of sage brushed the back of his throat. He swung the beam across the ground and saw only musk grass, rocks, and the station's own shadow. The scrape came again, softer this time, as if embarrassed to be heard. He aimed the beam to the ridge and held it there. The light flattened the world. The ridge, bright now, revealed nothing. "Hey," he called, because it would have been foolish not to. "If you're on the trail, call back." The parks closed after sunset. The canyon answered, but not like a city echo. His own voice came back dulled and slightly wrong, as if someone else was saying the same word with his throat. The sound lifted the small hairs on his arms. He should have made a note of it and gone inside. Instead, he stood and let the silence press against him. It is a strange thing to be watched by land, but he felt it then, like a weight across the shoulders. The station behind him breathed through its seams. The night remained hard and still. After a long count, he went back in, bolted the door, and returned to the chair. The coffee was now tepid. He drank it anyway. Past 10, the radio gave a small crackle. Static skittered like dry grass in wind. He adjusted the dial. Nothing came. No call sign. No bored voice over miles of wire. He rubbed his thumb across the metal and leaned closer. The static lifted a fraction, then settled again. He leaned back. He did not like feeling hopeful about noise. At 11, footsteps came. They did not arrive from afar. They were just there, under the window, as if the earth had grown feet and decided to try them out. They were bare, he thought immediately. Not boots, not shoes. The steps had a softness, a dampened thud that reminded him childhood summers of running from the river with wet soles. The steps moved past the window and stopped at the door. He did not move. The mug handle pressed a crescent into his palm. After a moment, the steps continued, rounding the corner, pausing beneath the second window where he slept during day shifts. He could hear the slow inhalation of his own breath and the faint tick of the metal desk cooling. He put the mug down and thought of calling the township. He did not want to speak into the radio while the steps were listening. When he stood, the chair legs made a small scrape that sounded loud, too loud. He winced. He hated that sound suddenly, hated that he had given the night anything of his, even that. He turned off the station light. Moonlight fell through the glass in a slab. Outside the window, the path was a pale ribbon, and above it, something moved. He did not let his eyes find a shape. He looked instead at the way the light changed at the edges, the way a shadow curled back from a presence. Whatever it was stood still. He could feel that stillness, a human kind of decision in it, like someone trying to remember if they had left the stove on. Then, without any visible shift, the presence was closer. He felt it the way you feel heat. His mouth was dry. The radio popped. He flinched, an instinct he hated himself for. The speaker gave a ghost of a whisper. He leaned down and turned the dial with careful fingers. The voice that came was his, not a mimicry. His, quiet, intimate, as if he had leaned very close to himself and spoken into his own ear. "Don't look outside," his voice said. He shut the radio off. He did not know why. He stared at the dark face of the box and waited for the world to reassemble. The footsteps had stopped. He could hear only the wind in the wires and the blood in his own head. He stood in that posture, bent slightly over the desk, for a span he could not later measure. Time in that room changed its weight. The night passed. It always does. When the low, colorless light of morning began lifting the world out of the black, he unlocked the door and stepped out carefully. The air smelled as if it had been washed and hung up to dry. He told himself he would find raccoon prints, or deer, or nothing. He found the prints immediately. Bare feet, human-sized, clean-edged in the dust, circling the station walls like a slow thought. Some prints were a bit longer than a man's, some tapering at the toes too neatly, like the wrong hand has tried to draw a foot from memory. One set stopped directly below the window where he had stood facing the glass. He tracked them with his eyes until the dust turned to rock and the rock turned to path. The prints went up the ridge away, then toward a slick rock chute that poured down into the canyon floor. He did not follow. You can follow what leaves ground behind. But he had no intention of stepping where that had stepped. He took the broom from the station closet and swept the threshold. He swept the prints from the doorstep and told himself that was for cleanliness. By afternoon, he was able to say the night had been long and odd and that fatigue had given common noises strange shapes. That story of the night fit inside him, and he liked having a lid for things. He wrote the incident sideways in the log, where it could hide between weather notes and a reminder to replace the porch bulb. The second night was colder. The stars came out as soon as the sun left, and the sky deepened like a bruise. He drank the coffee earlier, though he hated what the second cup did to his stomach. He kept the lights on longer than usual. He did not go to the door when the first scraping arrived. But spoke again, using the softness of his own voice. He turned in his chair and answered it as if he were writing a letter to a younger self. "Who is this?" he asked. Static, then the same voice. "You don't need to see me." He kept his eyes on the radio. "I'm not going to let you in." "Good," the voice said. "I'm not asking. What do you want?" "Nothing now." A small hitch, the breath he knew intimately. "Not looking is good." "I'm not going to look out there," he said, and realized that he already had. He had looked last night, had looked with his skin and the tiny muscles at the corners of his eyes. He sat down. "If you need medical help, say it plainly." Static became a long, patient hush. He turned the volume down and waited. The urge to step to the window was strong and strangely familiar, like wanting to check a locked door twice. He did not move. Somewhere outside, the wire sang a single, thin note and then stilled. The steps returned near midnight. They moved in a rough oval around the station, sometimes closer, sometimes far, like a reluctant procession. When they paused at the door this time, Daniel moved to the windowsill and placed his palm flat against the wood. He did not know why he did this, only that it felt like answering a question with a gesture rather than a word. Whoever stood outside did nothing. A minute passed, another. The footfalls drifted away. In the morning, he found one new thing, a single line in the dust, as if something had been dragged lightly across it. It began near the back wall and ended a few feet out, as if carried the rest of the way. He crouched to see it, and his knees popped, a simple domestic noise, reassuring. He told himself it was a dead branch, pulled in wind. He told himself it was a snake. He told himself many things that afternoon, and they crowded one another at the door of his mind, like guests unsure who should leave first. He took his dinner early. He read a manual about repeater towers 3 times. He cleaned the coffee pot and left it to dry upside down. He waited for dark. On the 3rd night, the ridgeline was sharper, the cold drier, and the moon thin enough to pretend it wasn't there. Coyote Canyon held the kind of quiet that makes a man feel as if he has been placed at the center of something more patient than he can understand. Daniel sat and listened to that patience and felt tired to the bone. At 10, the radio spoke with someone else's voice, a woman, breathless, calling a name he almost recognized. He leaned forward and tried to catch the words. They slipped at the edges, as if they had been pulled through wool. "Repeat," he said into the mic. "You're faint." The woman's voice returned stronger, and then he realized it was the township dispatcher, the exact timbre and cadence he knew from a dozen daytime calls. Relief moved through him like warm water. He answered and waited for instructions. The voice on the radio stumbled, then recovered, and then began to say things that did not belong. It used words out of order, names in the wrong places, a kind of official tone draped over nonsense. He tightened his grip on the microphone and said the dispatcher's name to the empty room. The radio set it back in his voice. He turned the set off. He unplugged it. He watched the blank face of the machine and waited for it to wake itself. It did not. He felt foolish, ridiculous, a man scaring himself with equipment. He plugged the power back in and left the switch off. Near midnight, the soft feet came again. They made a sound like rain that has been forgotten by the sky. He stood at the window, the lights off and tried to see nothing. That is not easy. The eye gulps for shape. A darker dark became a shoulder, and the shoulder became a face, and he was angry at himself for letting the eye do its old tricks. He leaned his temple lightly against the cool glass and breathed, and the window gave back a fog mirror of his face. In it he saw a shape that was not his. He kept his head still and moved his eyes, childish, like a boy pretending not to look. The shape at the edge of the glass did the same, a fraction too slow. He stepped back. The glass kept the mark of his breath for a long moment, then let it go. When morning came, the prints were not only around the station, but farther down the path leading to the ridge, then down the slick rock, then into the canyon itself. He saw, too, that some prints overlapped his from weeks before, when he had walked down at noon to check the old survey marker. The overlapping was neat, precise, as if someone had studied the exact rhythm of his stride and laid a foot gently atop it. He bent down and put his hand against one print. It was cool as any shadow. He stood and looked across the stone country and felt briefly, sharply, as if he had left something somewhere and would never find it again. He told himself then that he would leave the next day. He would ask to be reassigned to a station nearer town, where the radio carried the noise of weather and voices like a river, and the land did not speak in versions of himself. He wrote a terse note to his supervisor on a yellow pad and folded it into his jacket pocket. The note felt like a small, held light. The evening, as if hearing him decide, arrived early and crowded. The sky turned a color he could not name, one of those thin shades between blue and metal, and the station lights seemed to push only a little distance into it. He set the kettle on the small stove and listened to it begin to fuss. He cleaned the mug again. He did this slowly, as if there were nothing else to do. When the knock came, it came correctly, by all the rules. 3 gentle raps, exactly spaced, as if someone had practiced knocking in an empty room and liked the sound. He closed his eyes, which did nothing. He opened them again and looked at the door. He could see the wood bow inward slightly, the way it does when there is weight behind it. He did not answer. He could feel the urge rise in him to say the courteous thing, to say, "One moment," to say, "Who is it?" He swallowed and said nothing. The knock came again, then a third time, then silence. He stood a long while with his hands on the back of the chair. He stood until his fingers ached. He pulled the chair out and sat down. He rested his hands, palms up, on his knees. The radio, though unplugged, made a sound, a brief, unconfident crackle, like a match that changed its mind. He did not turn his head. He watched the door. He wanted for a second to be the sort of man who says prayers. He had never been that sort. When the voice came, it came from the window glass. Not through the radio, not under the door. The glass spoke softly with his own voice and said his name with a care that made him ill. "Daniel," it said, "you don't have to look." The voice said his name again, and there was a strain in it now, a kind of ache he recognized from nights when he had been careful with sorrow. He lifted his hands from his knees. His palms had been sweating. They left small crescents of damp on the fabric. He almost laughed at that, the sheer ordinariness of it. "Tell me what you want," he said, to the room, to the glass, to the canyon. His voice sounded dependable. He was glad for that. The voice used his shape of breath to say, I want you to stay inside." "I will," he said, "and I will walk," the voice said. He waited because he understood in some manner that if he spoke now, if he said anything, he would be answering a question that had not been asked. After a time, the footsteps began again, but this time they were different. Not bare, not soft. They sounded like a man in his own boots. He stood and went to the door and set the latch. He did not know why, only that some motions feel like shields. He went to the window and stood to one side of it and looked at the thin edge light on the glass. He could not see out. The interior of the room held him like water. Still, he knew, in the way you know, a storm is directly over the house, even in the blackout, that something stood near enough to see his breath. The walk around the station took a long time. Sometimes the steps faltered, as if the walker had come to a place where the ground ceased to be a thing and became an idea. Sometimes the steps hurried, then slowed. Once, something brushed the siding with a light insistence, a testing. He held his breath. He felt stupid for that, then did it again. The night passed. Dawn came the way it always does, uninvested and light-fingered. He opened the door and went out carefully. The ground was a diary of what had chosen to write itself. Boot prints were there, a perfect mirror of his own tread, but they were not alone. Bare prints still circled lazy arcs. Along the wall lay that long drag mark again, and this time he could see the cruelly simple truth of it. Someone had drawn a line with a finger, slow and deliberate, as if underlining a sentence for a child. He followed nothing. He swept nothing. He stood in the cold morning and listened to the metal in the roof tick as it caught the sun. That afternoon, he did what men always do when they do not know what else to do. He cleaned. He took the radio apart within the limits of his comfort and wiped dust from places dust had no business being. He stacked the few books the station owned and sharpened the pencils and threw away a map too old to be useful. He folded his request note twice more until it was a small square and put it back in his pocket. He boiled the kettle and made new coffee and hated it and drank it anyway. He did not decide to stay. He simply did not leave. The day slid past and he stayed. That is how most bargains begin. Not with words, but with an absence of a door closing. As evening found him again, he set his chair at an angle different from before, as if he could trick the night into using another approach. He placed the flashlight on the desk and kept his hand near it. He did not intend to pick it up. He only wanted the comfort of knowing it was still for him, that there was some device in the world that waited obediently to do what he asked. Outside, the first stars appeared like holes punched into a tar sheet. He smiled at that old image, one from a school teacher who had explained to him long ago how light travels farther than any traveler ever will. Coyote Canyon, wide and intent, breathed in. Daniel breathed out. Somewhere in the darkness, something answered the exchange with a footstep that was not soft, not hard, only certain. He sat very still, and in that stillness he understood the plainest shape of the matter. There are things that take the shape of your voice because that is the clearest doorway into a human house. There are places that learn how you walk because footsteps are the only honest script any of us ever write. There are long, patient distances that place a weight at your window to see if you will move toward it or away. He decided then that his part of the exchange would be refusal. He would not step to the door. He would not put his eye to the glass. He would not speak to the radio when it used his brother's laugh or his father's cough or the dispatcher's flat humor. He would be, finally, stubbornly, dull and uninteresting. He would offer the canyon nothing to mimic. It is difficult, he learned, to be dull while being terrified. Terror sets a kind of bright gloss on every thought, but he held to the decision as if it were a railing on a high stair, and hour by hour he found that fear can be walked through like a long room that no one ever dusts. Near midnight, the voice came again. It was his voice, but tired and older by a year he had not yet lived. It called from the window and asked him to step outside and see the moon. He sat and did not move. It asked him to check the door latch for safety. He did not stand. It used the dispatcher's style to tell him there was a hiker in distress 15 minutes down the ridge, calling for help. He did not reach for the radio. It tried names, 3 that he knew, 1 he had never told anyone. He felt the world narrow to a small, painful point. He kept sitting. When the voice finally stopped, the silence that followed felt like a mercy. He closed his eyes and counted backward from a number for which he had no liking. The station wood flexed. The wires sang. The moon rose. The prints were placed. The night tilted very slightly toward morning. He had not won anything. He had not solved anything. But he had drawn a boundary, and the canyon had seen it. Sometimes that is the only work a man can do, to place a line around himself and allow the night to knock against it until the night is bored. In the weak light that comes before dawn, Daniel stood and went to the door and opened it onto the cool air. He stepped out and looked down without looking out, a small, childish trick that still soothed him. The prints were everywhere, innumerable and tidy as lies. Yet along the threshold itself, the dust lay smooth and unbroken, a thin, clean border. He understood that at some point while he sat and listened, the night had leaned closer and then chosen not to cross. He did not celebrate this. He did not trust it. He only noted it and folded the knowledge away like another paper into a pocket already full. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked at the ridge without letting his gaze convert shapes into faces. The land was a black cutout against a lesser black. He thought that in an hour color would return, the worst of all human comforts, because color makes everything seem honest. He went back inside, set water to boil, and decided, without making a speech of it to himself, to serve the rest of his shift. Afterward, he would walk down into town with the request note and eat eggs at the diner and watch a waitress pour coffee into 100 chipped mugs. He would hear normal voices and see normal feet and be bored enough to regain the life he had intended to live. When the kettle sang, he poured and waited. He stood at the window one last time in that blue-gray hour where edges soften and what is far becomes briefly near. On the glass, a faint oval of breath appeared at the height of his own face, and for a heartbeat he wondered if he had left it there. He lifted his hand to wipe it, then stopped and let the oval fade on its own. He finished the cup. He wrote cleanly in the night log, uneventful. He clicked off the lamp and sat in the quiet. He watched the door without fear, not because fear had left, but because fatigue sometimes mocks fear until it lowers its eyes. At the shift change, Jacob from the day crew arrived as he always did, stamping dust from his boots, bringing the smell of sun and gasoline. Daniel had never been so glad to see a man with a squeaky belt. He said little. He nodded, took his jacket, and stepped out into the new light. The prints had already begun to warm and blur. He walked the path toward town. He kept his eyes on the ground, not because he feared what the distance would show him, but because the ground was honest. He moved at a measured pace, and for the first time in 3 nights, each step belonged only to him. Behind him, the station settled into its day shape. The canyon spread its patient, dry wings. Somewhere on the ridge, a breeze studied itself in the grass and became wind, and if the land spoke a name in the old, wrong way, it did so to empty air. Daniel did not look back. He carried his request note like a passport into a simpler country. He would return the keys at noon, he told himself. He would pour coffee from a pot that hissed for everyone. He would hear the cashier complain about coin rolls and the bus timetable, and he would be grateful for it, with the particular gratitude of those who have sat inside a night and learned just how much the ordinary day is worth. If he dreamed of a window after that, and of a voice that knew his breath, he did not say. If he woke sometimes with the strange sense that something had pressed its hand lightly to the other side of the glass, he did not rise to check it. He lay still and stared at the line where the ceiling met the wall and waited. Eventually, that patience of the long room returned, and he fell asleep the way a man falls into water that finally remembers his name. And in that sleep, far out in a desert where sound takes the river path and returns wearing another face, something walked a careful circle and left no prints at all. The night road to Vesper Ridge. When the last porch light vanished behind him, Owen Burrell drove into the dark hills of Vesper Ridge. The road was narrow, the air heavy with dust and sage. His headlights swept over dry grass and the skeleton of an old fire tower. That's when he saw her. A woman stood by the roadside, thin coat, dusty shoes, hair moving though there was no wind. Owen slowed. "Are you all right?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You shouldn't stop. Not here. It's late." "I can call someone, don't," she said quietly. "They'd come wrong." Her eyes lifted toward the ridge. "Go. They're almost here." Before Owen could answer, she was gone. Or maybe the light just forgot to hold her shape. He drove on to the small house he'd rented below the ridge, a lonely, square cabin beside a single cottonwood. Inside, the air smelled of dust and wood smoke. He locked the door and lay down fully dressed. He woke to a faint tapping. Once, twice, a pause, not a knock, a test. He listened. Then came the sound of steps, slow and careful, above him, on the roof. He stood in the dark, waiting for reason to return, but it didn't. Outside, the ridge loomed like a held breath. At the fence line, the woman stood again, half in shadow. "Lock your doors," she said softly. "Don't look at the windows when they knock." "Who are they?" he asked. "They're learning," she said. "Trying to be people." He didn't ask more. Her shape changed as she walked away, smaller, faster, lower, then silence. That night, something moved around the house. At the window, a face, his own, but wrong. The jaw too tight, the eyes too still, the skin reflecting light from the inside out. Open, it said, the voice uncertain, childlike. He didn't move. Open, please. The word please nearly broke him, but he stayed still. By morning, a piece of paper lay on the floor by the door. No words, only the smell of soil and something faintly alive. Owen left the next day. At the edge of the road stood a small cairn of stones. On top, a button. Beneath it, a thin, pale strip of something like skin. He didn't touch it. That night, 2 towns away, he woke before dawn. In the motel window, his reflection was watching him. Not angry, just studying. He raised a finger. It did the same. Then morning light broke it apart. Owen never spoke of Vesper Ridge again, but at home, when he sewed a button on a shirt, he did it carefully, not out of fear, but respect, because he knew someone, or something, might still be learning. And he remembered the only rule that mattered. He would not open